And we are going. Give me 1 second here before we start out. I just need to go ahead and get a link. Give me a second here. Start of a stream is always a little bit crazy. Okay. Stand by. Just sending the link out some places. There's that. Okay. Sorry about that. Always a bit hectic at the very beginning. So, let me take a drink of water and we'll get started. Okay, so hang on. My audio is peaking a little bit. Let me turn that down a bit. That is still kind of loud. How about now? Okay, that looks much better right here. Perfect. Okay, so let's get started. First story we've got here is from the Taipei Times. You can't see it up at the top quite. It's cropped out just a little bit. But, or sorry, this is not. This is our third story. Dumb me. Here we go. First one is from the Gateway Pundit. This is kind of the big story of today, I think, and one of the big stories, probably the big story from the from over the weekend, and it just happened today on Monday. It's not even the weekend, but we do not support Taiwan independence, says Tony Blinken gives green light to Chicoms to invade Taiwan. Now, I don't know if he gave the green light, but he certainly did not help Taiwan in getting legitimacy in the international stage at all. And he's also going against some remarks made by even members of the same administration. But let's see. I think they may have the
on Taiwan,
right
I reiterated the long-standing U.S. One China policy. That policy has not changed. It's guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, the 6 assurances. We do not support Taiwan independence. We remain opposed to any unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. We continue to expect the peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences.
So, yeah, this is pretty devastating. Secretary of State Tony Blinken traveled to China this past weekend to give the green light to the communist regime to invade Taiwan. Again, I don't know about this. Okay, this is a pretty partisan article, so we're going to go ahead and skip it. That said, this is one of the most terrible statements I have ever heard in geopolitics. It is awful. I'm not saying he's giving the green light. I just think it's grossly negligent and incompetent. It also comes contrary to what a lot of other people in the administration have said regarding supporting Taiwan. Green light to invade Taiwan, not so much. Green light to undercut any claims to legitimacy that Taiwan has and any efforts that the United States or its allies have in the region to work with Taiwan going forward? Yes. China will use this forever. To be honest, this doesn't come as a surprise. Mr. Blinken has also put out some pretty terrible statements in the past. He infamously pretended that there were no Americans left behind in Afghanistan and essentially turned his back on them. It was only due to the efforts of many veterans and special groups in a operation known as Pineapple Express that managed to get most of them out. But Anthony Blinken, I'm sorry, I don't like him. But that's my opinion. We're going to move past and actually talk about his visit. I don't believe this will have anything about his statement. It might, but Blinken and Xi pledged to stabilize deteriorated U.S.-China ties, but China rebuffs the main U.S. request. So, this comes from Beijing, from the Associated Press. Excuse me. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken met on Monday with Chinese President Xi Jinping and said they agreed to, quote, stabilize badly deteriorated U.S.-China ties, but America's top diplomat left Beijing with his biggest ask rebuffed: better communication between their militaries. After meeting Xi, Blinken said China was not ready to resume military-to-military contacts, something the U.S. considers crucial to avoid miscalculation and conflict, particularly over Taiwan. Still, China's main diplomat for the Western Hemisphere, Yang Tao, said he thought Blinken's visit to China marks, quote, a new beginning. The U.S. side is surely aware of why there is difficulty in military-to-military exchanges, he said. Hang on. He said, blaming the issue squarely on U.S. sanctions, which Blinken said revolved entirely around threats to American security. Yet Blinken and Xi pronounced themselves satisfied with progress made during the 2 days of talks without pointing to specific areas of agreement beyond a mutual decision to return to a broad agenda for cooperation and competition endorsed last year by Xi and President Joe Biden at a summit in Bali, which means nothing has been accomplished. And it remained unclear if those understandings can resolve their important disagreements, many of which have international implications. Still, both men said that they were pleased with the outcome of the highest-level U.S. visit to China in 5 years. The two sides expressed a willingness to hold more talks, but there is little indication that either side is prepared to bend from positions on issues including trade, Taiwan, human rights conditions in China and Hong Kong, Chinese military assertiveness in the South China Sea, and Russia's war in Ukraine. Blinken said later that the U.S. set limited objectives for the trip and achieved them. He told reporters before leaving for Ukraine Reconstruction Conference in London that he had raised the issue of military-to-military communications repeatedly. It is absolutely vital that we have these kinds of communications, he said. This is something that we're going to keep working on. The U.S. said since 2021, China has declined or failed to respond to over a dozen requests from the Department of Defense for top-level dialogues. According to a transcript of the meeting with Blinken, Xi said he was pleased with the outcome of Blinken's earlier meetings with the top Chinese diplomats and said restarting the Bali agenda were of great importance. Quote, the Chinese side has made our position clear, and the two sides have agreed to follow through, the common understandings President Biden and I have reached in Bali, Xi said. The agenda had been thrown into jeopardy in recent months, notably after the U.S. shot down a Chinese surveillance balloon over its airspace in February amid escalated military activity in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, combined with other disputes over human rights, trade, and opiate production. The list of problem areas is daunting. Why do I always yawning on the first story? I apologize. But Xi suggested the worst could be over. The two sides have also made progress and reached agreement on some specific issues, Xi said without elaborating, according to a transcript of the remarks released by the State Department. Quote, "This is very good." In his remarks, Xi, during a 35-minute session at the Great Hall of the People, a meeting that was expected but not announced until an hour before it started, Blinken said, quote, "The United States and China have an obligation and responsibility to manage our relationship. The United States is committed to doing that," Blinken said. "It's in the interest of the United States, in the interest of China, and the interest of the world." Blinken described his earlier discussions with senior Chinese officials as candid and constructive. Despite the symbolism of his presence in China, Blinken and other U.S. military officials had played down the prospects for any significant breakthroughs on the most vexing issues facing the planet's two largest economies. Instead, these officials have emphasized the importance of the two countries establishing and maintaining better lines of communication. Thus, China's refusal to resume the military-to-military contacts was a hitch. Quote, "Progress is hard," Blinken told reporters. "It takes time. It takes more than one visit." Blinken's trip is expected to herald a new round of visits by senior U.S. and Chinese officials to each other's countries, possibly including meeting between Xi and Biden in India or the U.S. in the coming months. Before meeting with Xi, Blinken met earlier Monday with China's top diplomat Wang Yi for about 3 hours, an encounter that produced a harsh assessment of the talks. China's foreign ministry said, quote, "It is necessary to make a choice between dialogue or confrontation, cooperation or conflict." It blamed the U.S., quote, "side's erroneous perception of China leading to incorrect policies towards China for the current, quote, low point in relations." And it said the U.S. bore responsibility for halting the spiraling decline of the U.S. We're going to go ahead and actually highlight this whole thing here. It said the U.S. bore responsibility for halting the spiraling decline of U.S.-China relations to push it back to a healthy and stable track. It added that Wang had, quote, "demanded that the U.S. stop hyping up the China threat theory, lift illegal unilateral sanctions against China, abandon suppression of China's technological development, and refrain from arbitrary interference in China's internal affairs." In its readout of the meeting, the State Department said Blinken, quote, "underscored the importance of responsibility in managing the competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China through open channels of communication to ensure competition does not veer into conflict." Using the acronym for, in the first round of talks on Sunday, Blinken met for nearly 6 hours with Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Yang, after which both countries said they had agreed to continue high-level discussions. Both the U.S. and China said Qin had accepted an invitation from Blinken to visit Washington, but Beijing made clear that, quote, "China-U.S. relationship is at the lowest point since its establishment." That sentiment is widely shared by U.S. officials. Blinken's visit came after his initial plans to travel to China were postponed in February after the shoot-down of a Chinese surveillance balloon over the United States. In his meeting, Blinken also pressed the Chinese to release detained American citizens and to take steps to curb the production and export of fentanyl precursors that are fueling the opioid crisis in the United States. Since the cancellation of Blinken's trip in February, there have been some high-level engagements. CIA Chief William Burns traveled to China in May, while China's Commerce Minister traveled to the U.S., and Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, met with senior Chinese Foreign Policy Advisor Wang Yi in Vienna in May. But those have been punctuated by bursts of angry rhetoric from both countries over the Taiwan Strait, their broader intentions in the Indo-Pacific, China's refusal to condemn Russia for its war against Ukraine, and U.S. allegations from Washington that Beijing is attempting to boost its worldwide surveillance capability, including in Cuba. And earlier this month, China's defense minister rebuffed a request from U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin for a meeting on the sidelines of a security symposium in Singapore, a sign of continuing discontent. Okay. So, essentially, China said, this is all the United States' fault. The U.S. has to back off of everything and agree that the South China Sea belongs to the South China Sea belongs to China, and that but when they said stop meddling in China's internal affairs, they're talking about that, and demanded that the U.S. stop hyping up anti-China rhetoric, etc. Boom, boom, boom. The U.S. got nothing from this, and the U.S. went, and they essentially said, okay, we'll give you a treat and basically say that Taiwan doesn't have a right to exist. And in return, the U.S. got a return of dialogue between the militaries of the PRC and the United States, right? The U.S. got something in return, yeah? No? The United States got nothing in return and disowned the existence of Taiwan, one of the most important countries in the world right now, the top semiconductor manufacturer in the world, produces 70% of the complex semiconductors in the world. And the United States went to China and said, Taiwan does not exist, and then flew away. All right. Blinken. President Biden, I really think you should get another guy for this job. But we're going to go ahead and move on to our next story, which is from the Taipei Times, ironically enough, which is that a satellite group to monitor China 24/7 is being developed. Taiwan is developing a new satellite constellation that would be capable of monitoring Chinese missile movements and submarines through clouds and at night. Taiwan Space Agency Director General Wu Yong-shin said in an interview yesterday. The agency began work on the Formosat 9 constellation earlier this year, and the program's centerpiece is the synthetic aperture radar system. He told the Liberty Times, the sister paper to the Taipei Times, assuming good orbital placement, that the SAR-bearing satellites can detect objects on Earth in adverse weather conditions or darkness that would have made optical imaging systems ineffective, Wu said. The ability of SAR, or SAR, satellites to observe at night would enable Taiwan to conduct up to 6 satellite passages per day to surveil sensitive Chinese sites, including submarine bases in Hunan and nuclear missile silos in Xinjiang, he said. The higher rate of passages would mean that the pattern of life analysis could be conducted on Chinese forces after a month of satellite operations, which would be a boon for national security, he said. Satellite imagery technology has significant potential for civilian use, as Formosat 5 showed in 2021 when the constellation detected a 15-hectare landslide in Kaohsiung and provided key information that helped the relief effort, Wu said. The agency's multispectral imaging-capable satellites were utilized by the nation's agricultural mission to fight a banana blight in Paraguay, he said. Starting this year, the Taiwan Space Agency is to launch 8 Formosat 9 optical satellites, including 6 1M resolution units and 2 hyper-resolution or 50 cm units, he said. In February, the agency inaugurated the B5G project to launch low Earth orbit communication satellites, part of an effort to reduce the nation's reliance on undersea internet cables, which are susceptible to accidental damage or sabotage, he said. Yes, and trust me, people have looked at that, I'm sure. Processing a satellite-based telecoms network is a vital component of national defense, as it makes a nation's digital infrastructure hard to disrupt, Wu said. In the Russia-Ukraine war, Elon Musk's Starlink has played an important role in sustaining Ukraine's ability to resist the invaders, he said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had made a point of streaming from Kyiv at various points of the conflict to assure the people that the government still stood, he said. According to the agency's estimates, ensuring uninterrupted telecommunications in Taiwan would require a constellation of 120 low Earth orbit satellites, each weighing 200 to 300 kilograms, which is similar to the technical specifications of Starlink, he said. Although the nation lacks the wherewithal in rocketry to launch that many, it can overcome many means other than a purely indigenous effort, while Taiwan's technology industry has the potential to produce the satellites itself, Wu said. The age of sixth-generation non-terrestrial networks is likely to be in about 5 to 6 years, and Taiwan should prepare to claim a piece of the supply chain of that technology, he said. Now, this is important. I decided to read this story because, where was it? I should have highlighted it. Yes, here we go. The nation's reliance on undersea internet cables, which are susceptible to accidental damage and sabotage. All right. So, at the beginning of the Ukraine war, the Russians severed a number of wires that went to a radar installation island. I think it was off the northern coast of Norway, I believe. I'm probably incorrect on that. I know they did it, I just don't remember where it was. And it's long been feared that should the Russians declare World War III, one of the first steps is they would cut the transatlantic cables. Similarly, there's a lot of concern about the undersea cables to Taiwan being cut by the Chinese or the North Koreans. It's also a fairly volcanically active part of the world, so it is entirely possible that an earthquake or a shift under the water or even a volcano could just destroy a cable outright. So it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, that's that story. We're going to go ahead and move on to the other side of the world. This is by the Times Herald. United Nations complains Russia blocks aid workers from area of Ukrainian dam collapse. Moscow says it's unsafe. The Kremlin spokesman said on Monday that the UN aid workers who want to visit areas ravaged by the recent Kakhovka dam collapse in southern Ukraine can't go there because fighting in the war makes it unsafe. United Nations rebuked Moscow on Sunday for allegedly denying aid workers access to the Russian-occupied areas where residents are stranded amid devastating destruction. The UN humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, Denise Brown, said in a sustainment effort that her staff were engaging with both Kyiv and Moscow, which control different parts of the area, in a bid to reach civilians in need. They face a shortage of drinking water and food and a lack of power. Brown urged Russian authorities, quote, to act in accordance with their obligations under an international humanitarian law and let them in. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov didn't explicitly admit that Russia had blocked UN access, but told a conference call with reporters that Ukrainian attacks made a visit too risky. Quote, there has been constant shelling, constant provocations, civilian facilities and the civilian population have come under fire, people have died, so it is really difficult to ensure their security, Peskov said. His comments came amid varying accounts of survivors of the quality of assistance that Russia is providing in the areas it controls. The dam lies on the Dnieper River, which forms the front line between Russian and Ukrainian forces on the eastern and western banks, respectively. Many evacuees and residents accuse Russian authorities of doing little or nothing to help. Some civilians said that the evacuees were sometimes forced to present Russian passports if they wanted to leave. On the Ukrainian side, Rescuers are braving Russian snipers as they rush to ferry Ukrainians out of the Russia-occupied flood zones. Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs, here we go with me being terrible at names, Ihor Klemenko said on Monday that the death toll resulting from the dam collapse has risen to 18. I'm sure it's much, much higher than that. 14 from drowning and 4 from gunshot wounds sustained during evacuation. A further 31 people were missing, he said. You can only hope that a lot of those areas were already evacuated because of the fighting before this happened. Ukraine's presidential office said on Monday that the Kherson region affected by the flooding had endured 35 Russian attacks over the previous 24 hours. Exclusive drone photos and information obtained by the Associated Press indicate that Moscow had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to blow up the dam, which was under Russian control earlier this month. Before we move on, I'm just going to go ahead and back that claim up because there are a lot of people who believe that the Ukrainians did this. It would have taken about 2 semi-trucks worth of explosives, full semi-trucks worth of explosives, to destroy this dam. This dam, which was in Russian-occupied territory. The explosives would have had to be placed in the turbine rooms deep in the dam, and for that to happen with no fighting whatsoever is incomprehensible. It's also worth noting that, well, yes, this does create a supply issue for areas downstream like further Russian-controlled areas. It is also in Crimea. It's also worth noting that this completely blocked the Ukrainians from being able to do any kind of amphibious assault through the reservoir or over the river downstream of the dam or over the road on top of the dam, which allowed the Russians to completely shore up that location and reallocate resources elsewhere to thinner areas. And even after the water began to recede, which it is already beginning to, you will have such incredibly thick mud that still operations and assaults from that region are going to be weeks away, if not longer. So, there you go. Okay. The explosion occurred as Ukraine mustered for a counteroffensive. Kyiv's forces have intensified attacks along the 1,000-kilometer front line recently. Some analysts saw the dam breach as a Russian effort to thwart Ukrainians' counteroffensive in the Kherson region. The UK Defense Ministry said on Monday that Russia had recently redeployed several thousand troops from the banks of the Dnieper to buttress its positions in the Zaporizhzhia and Bakhmut sectors, which reportedly have reportedly seen heavy fighting. So there you go. Basically saying the same thing I had just said. The move, quote, likely reflects Russia's perception that a major Ukrainian attack across the Dnieper is now less likely, following the dam's collapse, the ministry said in a tweet. Ukrainian forces have advanced up to 7 kilometers or 4 miles into territory previously held by Russia, she said. Russia's defense ministry didn't confirm losing any ground to the Ukrainian forces. In response to, quote, increased attacks by the occupiers, Ukrainian President Zelensky said on Monday in his nightly address that Ukrainian soldiers were, quote, moving forward in some directions, defending their positions in some other directions. Quote, we have no lost positions, only liberated ones, he asserted. It isn't possible to independently verify battlefield claims by either side. Russia is also pursuing offensive actions, according to Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar. Russia has concentrated a significant number of its military units, and particularly airborne assault troops in Ukraine's east, she said. They are stepping up Moscow's offensive around the, Kubinsk in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv province and Lyman in the eastern Donetsk province, Malimar said on Telegram. Ukrainian forces may have put their counteroffensive operations on hold as they review their tactics, according to the Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank, and we will actually talk about that a little bit in a minute. It noted that Kyiv has not yet committed the majority of its available forces to counteroffensive operations and has not yet launched its main effort. I'm sorry for the barking. Russia. Let's see. Russia attacked south and southeast Ukraine overnight with cruise missiles and self-exploding drones. Ukraine's Air Force reported Monday 4 caliber missiles and 4 Iranian-made Shahad drones were shot down, it said. According to regional officials, the southern province of Odessa and southeastern Donetsk were targeted by the attack. No casualties or damage were immediately reported. 3 civilians were wounded by artillery fire in the Berislav district in the Kherson province. Monday, local officials said a 64-year-old woman was in critical condition. According to their Telegram post, at least 5 residential buildings, 2 private residences, and an administrative building sustained damage. Officials in Russia's southern Belgorod region, which borders Ukraine, said Monday morning that 7 people, including a child, were wounded in Ukrainian drone attacks over the previous 24 hours. So this was a Associated Press writer, Elise Morton, and contributed from London. Okay, so the thing on Ukrainian forces may have put their counteroffensive operations on hold. I wish that I had known that they were going to cite the Institute for the Study of War, because I would have brought that up too. But, yeah, one of the issues is, unlike with the September offensive, the Russians knew that they were going to get steamrolled, so they built secondary defensive positions. So when the Ukrainians did the September offensive, which was very, very effective, they pushed through. They broke the Russian line and managed to get behind their back line and got the Russian forces from the inside out. Knowing that that was what the Ukrainians were going to attempt to do, the Russians built a defensive line, and then they built another defensive line behind that one, so that these guys could fall back to this one if they could, and if they were wiped out, you still had forces here that would be firing on the Ukrainians while the Ukrainians were trying to hit the front line. That makes it much, much more difficult to push through an attack. In addition, the much heralded Western armor that the Ukrainians have, most of it I don't believe has been committed. And there is a video that has been everywhere of a convoy of American-made Bradley M2, A2 Bradleys, and some Leopard to A6 main battle tanks that were destroyed out in the open. That comes from, I believe it was 2 Ka-52 attack helicopters that the Russians popped up over the trees and just destroyed the entire convoy. This is a continuing problem that the Ukrainians are having right now, is these attack helicopters are making moving any amounts of troops and armor through no man's land very difficult. It's reinforcing the kind of neo World War I-esque situation we're in, where neither side can really breach the other side's lines. And the Ukrainians are making up for this by getting things like Stinger missiles set up, but the Stingers don't have the range that some of these anti-tank systems have, that these aircraft have, and also the Stinger missiles are very reactive. Like, by the time you can get a Stinger online for these attacks, if you have forces that are moving in to the Russian lines, they've already been destroyed by the time a Stinger can even be fired on that helicopter. A lot of people are saying, well, if the Ukrainians had F-16s, they'd be able to deal with that because they'd have air superiority. No. The F-16 is one of the best fighters ever made. I believe it is better than any Russian aircraft that is flying over Ukraine right now. The Russians have AWACS. They have, I forget the name of the aircraft, but it is a flying radar dish where they can vector their fighters onto incoming Ukrainian aircraft at any point, which means gaining air superiority is very difficult because the Russians have better situational awareness, even if their pilots are less trained. The other thing is the Russians, no matter what, will have more aircraft that they can pull on, and they have some of the most advanced air-to-air missiles in the world. So the F-16 is going to definitely do some heavy lifting. It will not achieve full air superiority. You also have to remember that the Russians have the S-400 integrated air defense network, which is one of the best anti-air systems in the world, deployed all over eastern Ukraine. So the F-16 would be of pretty limited use in this situation anyway. So we'd be back in square one right now with these attack helicopters being a real nuisance and Ukraine not really having a great way to deal with them. Ironically enough, Russia has a good way to deal with attack helicopters like this because the Russians, ironically right now, are mimicking some NATO strategies with attack helicopters, and those strategies prompted the Russians and the Soviets before them to develop anti-aircraft systems for this specifically. The Shilka, the ZU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft system and its successor, the Tunguska, are short to mid-range anti-aircraft systems, which have radar-guided guns that can very quickly go onto a target and shoot at it instantly. And in the case of the Tunguska, it has guns and it has surface-to-air missiles like Stingers. If the Ukrainians had systems like this in their armor convoys, they would have much better protection against attack helicopters. The West never really made these. I'm going to actually try and find a picture here. Let's see here. Let's see. Bradley ADAT system. Where is it? Here we go. Here it is. This thing was a concept that was pretty quickly rejected. It didn't see a lot of service. Very similar. You have a radar-guided gun that can go straight to an attack helicopter, a low-flying aircraft, and you have 4 surface-to-air missiles on each side. If the Ukrainians had something like this, they would be doing a lot better against those attack helicopters. But the U.S. and NATO at large abandoned these, and I don't entirely know why, if we're being completely honest. Anyway, that was a long tangent on to why I think the counteroffensive isn't going as well as some people were expecting it to. It's by no means stalled or a failure, as some people would also say, but just because it's not going as well as the September offensive does not mean that it is a failure. Moving on. Here, this is by Tatsugami UA on Twitter, and it's an updated visual assessment which confirms the low water level of the Kakhovka Reservoir, specifically in the area surrounding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and Nikopol. It is evident that the water level in these locations continues to remain consistently low. So yeah, this is pretty dramatic, honestly. Like, if you look at this, very, very dramatic. Boom, 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 boom. Like, and that's all mud. So the idea that the Ukrainians could move across this, no way. So the Russians did this to secure a flank, absolutely. Moving on. So yes, this is from The Hill, and it is Ukrainian leaders say that they have retaken 8 villages in the counteroffensive. Let's see if I can get this whole thing to fit here. Not really. This webpage is a weird one. All right. So, Ukrainian leaders on Monday, let's pause that, said that they had liberated an 8th village in the counteroffensive launched about 2 weeks ago as forces continue to inch through heavily fortified Russian-occupied territory. Remember what I was saying about that back reinforced line? That's what they're running up against. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said forces had retaken the town of, oh boy, here we go, Piatskiavsky, in southeastern Zaporizhzhia region. I had pronounced this right earlier, now I can't do it again. Where a major Ukrainian advance is continuing to make slow but steady progress through entrenched Russian lines. Ukraine has now freed up to 70 miles of territory in the southern region of Maliar, Maliar wrote on Telegram. Russian military bloggers also confirmed the presence of Ukrainian troops in that town, but said that they were unable to move forward after coming under heavy fire from Russian artillery. Ukraine has also announced that it has retaken 7 other towns: Labkov, Levindyne, man, I'm bad at this, Novdiaki, these ones. We're just going to go with these ones. I'm sorry. And yeah, these towns are on the edges of Russian-occupied territory in the region and in the southern Donetsk region. Quote, our troops are advancing position by position, step by step. We are moving forward, Ukrainian President Zelensky said in a Sunday address. Independent Western analysts have assessed Ukraine is making incremental progress in the first wave of the counteroffensive, which is expected to stretch on 4 months. However, Ukrainians have been taking heavy losses, which Moscow seized on as a sign the operation is failing. Russian President Vladimir Putin last week said that Ukraine has, quote, no chance for the counteroffensive to be successful and claimed Kyiv was suffering a, quote, catastrophic defeat. Some losses are expected in the beginning as officers look for weaknesses in the Russian defenses. This is an unfortunate reality of very nasty peer-on-peer conflicts like this, is you have what are referred to as probing attacks. The people who go on those probing attacks know that they're not going on a suicide mission, but they're going on a pretty dangerous mission. You go out beyond the wire and you poke at the enemy lines to see where the weak points are and where the heavily fortified points are. There's a very good chance sometimes that when you hit those heavily fortified points, they hit you harder and you don't get to leave. And that's happened a few times. Let's see. The UK Defense Ministry on Sunday said both sides are suffering heavy losses, with Russians taking the highest number of casualties since the peak for the battle. The highest casualties since the peak for the Battle of Bakhmut in March. That's not surprising, considering I've seen some drone footage of Russian forces murdering their own people that are trying to retreat. The same thing that the Soviets did, the Red Army, during the Nazis in the 1940s when they tried to retreat. So, I mean, of course the Russians are going to have higher casualties because they literally throw people away like nothing. Ukraine's counteroffensive is wide-ranging, with forces moving in several directions. In the south and in the east near Bakhmut, where heavy fighting continue. Russia took control of Bakhmut in May after months of a territorial warfare, which, again, has just been horrible trench warfare. In the south, Ukrainian forces are moving forward or toward the cities of Mariupol and Bryansk on the Sea of Azov, which, if reached, would enable Kyiv to cut off a crucial land bridge from mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. It would also give them a clean shot at the Kerch bridge that goes from mainland Russia to Crimea, which would completely cut Crimea off from mainland Russia except for supplies being shipped in, which, again, Ukraine would be close enough to destroy those supply ships. So, pretty crucial there if the Ukrainians manage to get there. Russian forces are also moving into an offensive phase of their own in eastern Ukraine, putting some pressure on Ukrainian troops to defend territory during the counteroffensive. Brilliant move, by the way. I hate to say that about the Russians, but that's actually smart to have your own offensive plan to kick off when the enemy launches their own offensive. You push them off balance. How effective Russia's offensive will be, I don't know. I doubt they'll be as overconfident or as well equipped as they were at the beginning of 2022, but we'll see. Russia is attacking toward the town of Lyman in northern Donetsk, and in the towns of Avatka and Marinka further south. Melnyar said Ukrainian soldiers are successfully defending against the Russian assault, but described it as difficult with, quote, hot battles across the front. Quote, we did not lose a single meter of ground in these directions thanks to the professionalism and courage of our fighters, she wrote. Our troops act courageously in the face of the enemy's supremacy and forces. So, okay. Moving on. To kind of back this up a little bit, this is from, before we start this is from Bradley Afric, who has some amazing stuff. This is Russian forces in Ukraine have constructed layers of fortifications between the occupied cities of Poloy and Tomok. The satellite imagery shows some of the defenses built along the 50 kilometers of highway connecting the two cities. You'll kind of see what I was talking about here with some of these back line defensive positions. Like you have your front position and then you have your back position. So if you get overrun here, you can run back to this one. You also have people from here shooting into this one when the Ukrainians get to it. This is a tough nut to crack. Also, you can see here, similar deal, which is much longer, but similar situation. This is a lot of defensive positions. So pushing through this is certainly not easy. Not easy at all. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next story. From The Print. Free trade agreement between Iran and Russia likely by year-end, reports TASS news agency. Careful with TASS, but Moscow, a free trade zone agreement between Iran and Russia and several countries that cover the vast Eurasian region, spreading from the borders of Eastern Europe to Western China, is possible by the end of the year, Russia's TASS news agency reported on Monday. More again. Sorry about that. Come here. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Ovchynnik told the state news agency in an interview that talks between the Eurasian Economic Union, which comprises Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia and Iran, are in their final stages. Quote, we are moving forward. Ovchynnik said, we very much hope that such an agreement can be signed by the end of this year. Both the region and Iran have taken on additional significance for the Kremlin after Western sanctions over Moscow's invasion in Ukraine limited Russia's foreign trade routes and forced it to look for markets outside Europe. However, despite tighter ties between Moscow and Tehran since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, began big purchases of Iranian-made drones to attack the country, trade between the two markets have grown only moderately. Russian-Iranian commodity turnover rose 20% in 2022, according to government data, two-thirds overall, the growth rate Moscow saw with China, another key partner, with whom Russia has expanded political and economic ties in the last 2 years. The regional agreement with Iran would replace and expand an interim pact that already provides a reduction in customs duties on hundreds of categories of goods. In November 2022, Russia started swapping oil products with Iran, and in March, Tehran said it counts on huge volumes of both oil and gas swaps with Moscow. Ovchynnik also told TASS although providing much detail that negotiations among Eurasian Economic Union countries on creating a common gas market continue. Okay, so seeing a new alliance kind of build. But that brings us actually to our last point today, which is the end of a journey. Oryx is an amazing channel or Twitter account who I followed for quite some time and gained fame over the war in Ukraine, counting the losses that the Russians were taking in vehicles, counting them all up, tallying them. Someone that many people, even at high up levels in government, have looked to for his numbers and his accuracy. And so he has announced on the 19th of June, 2023, quote, "Dear all, I would hereby like to inform you that I will be ending Oryx on October 1st. I originally started Oryx blog 10 years ago to cure my boredom. Little did I know Oryx would escalate into the all-consuming project that it is today. All of us work on the articles and lists in our free time. It's not our job. We don't get paid, though I hoped our work would one day lead to a job. No such thing occurred. Oryx just doesn't make me happy anymore, and continuing it prevents me from finding a happier place in life." So, yeah, a unfortunate event for the open source intelligence community for sure. Again, I followed Oryx's work for a very, very long time through conflicts well before the Russian war, and he's always been very good. So, to Oryx, once you do retire, I hope you find something else that makes you happier. And that takes us to the end of this episode. I know I was gone for a week there. I had a lot of traveling, and then my office flooded while I was out of town, which is why things look a little disheveled in here. It is. As soon as I hit the end stream button, I'm going to turn a bunch of fans on to continue getting moisture out of the carpet. So that's fun. But I'm here again. I'm here now. You'll see me on Friday. As always, this is World in Context. I'm Ryan Osborne. I've been your host. And I hope you have a good week. I'll see you on